Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade, and this is the Education Show, and I am so glad to be talking today with Vernee Wilkinson from School Facts Boston. Vernee, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me this morning. It's nice to be with you, Alexander.
For people who might not know, who are you and what's your stake in Boston schools and the media coverage of schools?
Sure, of course. I'm Vernee, Executive Director of School Facts Boston. We're a family organization, so we focus on meeting with cohorts of students and parents and supporting them and encouraging them in their education journey, because the education journey on our local landscape has a tendency to take a lot of twists and turns. So we want folks to know that they're not alone and that they have each other to listen, to share, to be heard, and to advocate for the best needs of themselves and their households.
The parent perspective on schools and schools coverage is really important to the grade. And for those of you who may recognize Vernee's name, Vernee's been in newsletters and done interviews with us in the past, which we really appreciate. What is the big one or two issues facing parents who are sending their kids to Boston Public Schools right now at the beginning of 2026?
At the start of 2026, the primary issue is, or more than primary issue, I guess the most timely issue is around schools moving and mergers within the district. This is ongoing work that's been going on throughout the district over the past probably 3 years. But at this point, that work is picking up some momentum within the district. And as a result, the community is feeling that impact. So that would be one of the most timely issues. And then I would say parallel, or even in some cases like outranking an issue of that sort, is just ongoing challenges in outcomes for students within our district. I think the perception versus the reality of outcomes for Boston Public School students might be there's a bit of a disconnect.
For folks who don't know, you're here to give us the inside scoop. What's the perception and what's the reality when it comes to outcomes?
Sure. So I think Boston as a landscape, as a city, is seen to be a place that is resourced and prospering, and a lot of things go well in a lot of different ways, which is why the schools, public education, K through 12 education, should be thriving much more than it actually is. Boston thinks of itself in many ways as a kind of like a title town, a city of champions. And in my opinion, there's really not as much room or need for, celebrations and duck boats down the streets and, Dunkin' Donuts flowing in the rivers if our young people aren't thriving on the same level. So I think the perception versus reality, there's a gap also because Boston has so much higher education that people come and seek out from all corners of the world. Boston's thought of as an education town, but when you look at K through 12 education, you don't have to dig very deep to see that student outcomes aren't as like positive and prosperous as they should be,
Right.
especially for low income students and Black and Brown students. It's not a surprising story, but it's a story that I think many outside of Boston might not know is
Right.
actually the narrative on this landscape.
Right. The comparison that comes to mind would be San Francisco, or maybe DC,
Hmm.
schools that are thought of one way, but then the people who work in them or help those who send their kids to them know is quite different. What's your take on the media coverage of schools? Boston has more than the average bears newsrooms,
Hmm.
2 public radio stations, the Globe, etc. What's your overall take on the coverage of the schools in terms of quantity and quality?
I would say there's generally, especially from like the press and the Globe, um, there's consistent coverage within um, Boston Public Schools on the side of like print media, online media with the Globe. I know that, we're in a time where our public media is being stretched a bit thin. So I do think there's probably been some gaps in coverage over the past probably year or so, from more of our like local public media. But the Globe continues to consistently update and share on the large issues that are going through Boston Public Schools and the surrounding area.
And what about informal or non-traditional information sources?
Mhm.
There's the last night school committee meeting podcast. There's
Mhm.
schoolyard news. There might be some others. I'm always looking for a secret Facebook group. If there's a secret Facebook group, please tell me and everyone else. How's the informal ecosystem for school information that your parents might be or you might be getting?
Yeah, there's definitely informal networks. I don't know how much though some of those outlets are really tapped into or like direct access points for parents that are waking up with the sun and packing lunches and commuting downtown and living their day-to-day lives. I don't know how much those sources and sources like those are feeding and interconnected with daily family engagement. I think
Are they
you know
useful? Sorry to interrupt. Are they useful to community advocates and parent advocates like yourself?
I think for advocates and broader community members, it's a way to kind of either like share information or to pulse check. Like, oh, coming out of school committee meeting, this past Wednesday, this is a thought that was on my mind, or that's kind of how I read the room. Cross checking other resources to see if there's a certain general like consistent consensus around like tone or concerns um, or just general reflections after that moment. So I think it's a lot of those resources end up hitting for the broader landscape as opposed to day-to-day family life, which in many ways is the kind of the connects to the root complexities that family voice and experience isn't being centered within the district nearly as much as it needs to be.
One of the questions I have related to this is how much the coverage focuses on, or should focus on, according to you, on what I'm going to call Trump topics:
Mm,
immigration, DEI, anti-DEI,
mm,
kinds of pronouncements from Washington versus um, schools, literacy, attendance, safety. Um, do you feel like the mix of coverage you see is appropriate for what people are interested in, need to know, or do you feel like there's an imbalance either way?
um, I feel that for the most part, it's an appropriate mix because the as you were saying, the Trump topics they do feel for so many folks um so broad sweeping and in many cases can feel very like overwhelming for the day-to-day life of students and families. So most of the coverage I think um tends to be more on the local side, and when the broader like federal issues have a local impact, such as if students and families are um, being challenged, and um, attendance rates are dropping in schools in direct correlation to ICE
Right.
mandates. That's when a national issue becomes a local issue. The district has been tracking that in, I think, a very thoughtful way as school and community leaders, and doing their best to reassure families, and press coverage has been following accordingly.
You are a bit of a media figure in the Boston area. What's your own personal experience? I mean, professional personal experience, being covered. You talk to reporters, you've been featured. Has the coverage you've received or your efforts have received been, has it been responsive? Has it been accurate, etc.?
Yeah, I would say responsive and accurate, for the most part. It's an ongoing journey, um, of many of the topical things that have been touched on over the years. One that I continue to look for more time and energy and transparency to be spent time on would be around school-based equity roundtables within Boston Public Schools. Um, that's an initiative that was launched probably closer to the 2021 timeline. And I think at a time where the district could really um, gain some footing and rebuild some community trust. I think that resource would be invaluable, but that resource still kind of lays a bit untouched, and from a media standpoint, not covered.
What else do education reporters, editors seem to not get or understand that a BPS insider understands about the school system? Are there other things that are just invisible or, for perplexing reasons, uninteresting to education reporters?
I don't know if I would press to say that they're topically things that are unknown. I think a lot of it comes down to timing, bandwidth, and the political will to step out on certain issues and certain topics. So there's a lot of plates being juggled that I'm not always privy to strategy and that sort of thing.
Right.
But from time to time, you can see moments in the discourse where it feels like an article might have pulled back a little bit, or topically a central point might not have been centered in the way that you thought it would be. But um, it's an ongoing process, and the press has relationships that they're managing with city and education leaders as well. So the political landscape is very much in the mix.
Is the end result the coverage that's overly deferential to the school system? I've heard this said. I've also heard it said that it's overly critical of the school system. What's your take on deference to schools versus close scrutiny?
Um, yeah, I wouldn't say it's deferential to the school system or to city leaders. I do know that the district at times does feel that it's overly critical. Um, that's not necessarily my point of view, or at that point, I would be more interested in even almost a counterpoint. If there was a moment where it felt that press came down hard on the district by way of the district's opinion, it's like, well, then if it's felt that that was critical, then what is the point of view? What is the messaging that you would have wanted to see instead? The pathways to communication and engagement with the district and city leaders that make school decisions have lessened over I would say, past like 5 years. So it leaves a gap that folks are going to fill in those gaps if there's not more proactive pathways to thoughtful community engagement, which is why I continue to reference resources and tools like the school-based equity roundtables.
So there's a vacuum. Can you say a little bit more about that? It sounds like there's a vacuum either in process or communication or substance. What's the vacuum?
I think it has a pretty broad, sweeping historic footprint, because Boston Public Schools are seen as a third rail issue for local politicians. The mayor is the head of Boston Public Schools, and I think even locally, many folks might not make that calculation because it's an appointed school committee. And even though it was voted upon for there to be either an elected or hybrid school committee, we're still functioning under a elected or an appointed school committee. So as it's grown and grown and grown as a third rail issue, I think city leaders over the years have kind of closed the ranks more and more in terms of what community engagement looks like. So there's less room or opportunity for pushback, and
So
things just kind of move forward despite even if there's kind of community outcry, which was very vocal and very present in the last two school committee meetings of the calendar year as it related to school mergers and closings.
in November and December, you're talking about
The last two December meetings,
last two December meetings,
right up
and
to the wire.
so there's this tendency to it's sort of over. The system is sort of over centralized. Is that what you're describing? That the local school and sub-district level community issues aren't addressed by community officials because they just say talk to City Hall about it?
Yeah, I guess to kind of play out the scene a little bit, in probably mid-November at the earliest, a round of school mergers and closings were announced. And so following that announcement, there was on the calendar two school committee meetings before the vote, including the last meeting was also the vote. So the public organized and came out in very, very robust opposition to the proposed closings and mergers. And the school committee, in the end, still voted in favor of the closings and mergers. Not quite unanimous. I think there was maybe one or two school committee members that didn't vote for that work to move forward. And so there's a disconnect. If you played that out in any other, kind of like category in your life, if you make a decision or propose a plan and then 50 people show up on your front lawn and you say, well, I'm going to do it anyway, there's something missing in between in the way that decisions are being made, the way decisions are being communicated, and the way that the community doesn't feel that it's being heard, embraced, and included along the way for decisions that will impact them,
Right.
their children,
Right.
their grandchildren for generations to come.
And in other places, a board would pull the decision or would adjust. School systems need to do something in the face of dwindling enrollment, but oftentimes, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know here, the initial plans or even the second run plans are ham-fisted, don't make sense to the people who are going to be affected. But usually there's a responsiveness, and it sounds like the responsiveness is missing here.
Yeah, the responsiveness is missing in the reactive moment, and I think there's 101 opportunities missed for proactive moments. And
Right.
I think we're going to continue to see this cycle of, you know, Camp A versus Camp B if there isn't more proactive communication integrated. So, like the way that I'm seeing it in this moment is if you're rebuilding the district, brick by brick, in this physical form, there's also an opportunity and a responsibility in the same moment to rebuild the communication channels and to rebuild trust, because that is also currently in shambles. So if you know that the physical space is in shambles and everybody agrees that like there's work that needs to be done, we're working, currently functioning with pre-war buildings
Mm-hmm.
and low enrollment. So like there's work that needs to be done, but how that work is done
Right.
is being bypassed time and time again, on top of the shoulders and the backs of communities that have felt pushed aside and disrespected for quite a while.
Right.
Boston had a robust conversation probably 2 to 3 years ago around reparations. And so I'm often curious, what does education reparations look like? And what does that repair look like for these families? And I think where many pathways off from what reparations looks like. So
Right.
in the meantime, it's like, well, how can we focus on respectful and thoughtful decision making that includes families and students, while also, if you're moving forward with these decisions, that there's a large swath of the community that doesn't feel in support of these decisions. And the district, specifically the superintendent, has used the word grief as it
Mm.
relates to closings and mergers. So I've heard her use that word recently on school committee, and also probably 2 to 3 years ago, when these closings and mergers were starting. It's like, well, if you're naming and knowing as a leader that grief is present and inevitable, what is your response for grief counseling? You can't say there's going to be grief without having, and you don't have to call it grief counseling, but transition support services, if you want to get really operational about it. So there's a lot of heart and thoughtfulness that's essentially being bulldozed, and the community feels it, even before the 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 first demo day has begun. They're feeling the impact already.
And is there anyone out there in the traditional legacy media, in the community, or what's sometimes called ethnic media,
Hmm.
or just anyone with a pen or a voice and an audience? Is there anyone out there who's really championing this topic or this concern? Did the protests get covered?
The protests were covered. I would say they were covered relatively thoughtfully. Um, but how many protests are we going to cover before we start to talk about the reason there's a protest in the first place?
And did
So
that happen or no?
I don't, I, it's, the cycle of protests is going to continue, even as you change topics, because um, the foundation of communication and trust is just,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't exist.
And in the old days, there used to be something called the Boston Phoenix. I've got family in Boston, so I remember the Phoenix. And the Phoenix sometimes would put out deep investigations or sort of fire-breathing critiques of public services, including schools. And there used to be the Emancipator, which covered education issues at least occasionally and came at them in a really strong way. Is there I'm thinking that the answer is no because I've asked twice now, but is there anyone out there who has the perspective and the energy that you think would be appropriate given the situation?
I think the leverage point at this stage of, you know, the leverage point is for the more primary media sources to take that on, because those are the media sources that the school and city officials are cross-checking. And
Right.
so I think there's opportunity, and I think in some ways it's even being done, where maybe some of the non-traditional resources are saying some of these things or saying similar things. Um, but it's really the opportunity and, in my opinion, the responsibility um, for the primary resources to kind of tip that balance in a way that they haven't,
Right.
historically. So over the summer, um, when the Boston mayoral race was picking up a little bit of momentum, the Globe reported from their editorial team a list of like 5 uh, debates that the candidates should be having over the course of the mayoral campaign. And one of those was a debate on education, and that was their suggestion. But I also think them being the outlet and the resource that they are, there was also an opportunity for them to host that debate, which never
Right.
happened
Right.
because there wasn't enough bandwidth, there wasn't enough power and leverage around that debate taking place. So now we've been through 2 mayoral cycles in Boston with no education debate, which is a disservice to the public in a timeline when education continues to struggle. Even if we already, in a sense, really know or might know based on polling what the outcome of the election might be, um, there's still a political process that's being sidestepped, and it's being sidestepped intentionally.
In some of the places I've read or written about, Chicago, Los Angeles, where mayors have been closely involved in education, the challenge has been the hyper centralization that you describe, but the opportunity has been also that City Hall can be very, very responsive to media coverage, and also political reporters. And
Mm-hmm.
I probably over-index the role of coverage and influencing decisions, but then you get the political reporters. New York City is a great example of this. You get City Hall reporters who have an excuse to write about what's going on behind the scenes
Mm-hmm.
on education issues. Has there been any involvement from the political reporter side, either a news reporter or a columnist, um, who's able to, for example, what a City Hall reporter would say about a mayor deciding to have an education speech might be different than the more substantive uh, coverage that an educational reporter would give. Is there any silver lining to the mayoral control and the involvement or predominance of City Hall and schools?
Um, I think the political reporters are testing the waters in that regard. But I don't think that there's, as it relates to education, I don't think there's traction to this point, in like the capacity of like, possibly like applying a certain amount of pressure that
Mm-hmm.
would require the responsiveness that community members are really longing for. So
Right.
I think it's in it's beta phase.
I let's wrap up by talking about things we like or hope for the future.
Hmm.
I loved the Emancipators coverage of the busing anniversary from 6 or 8 months ago. I loved the the valedictorians project from 5 or 6 years ago, which highlighted the gap between perceptions and actualities. I've heard that there's some really high quality reporters out there whose names are new to me. A couple of people recently have mentioned Sam Drysdale, who I think is a State House reporter who sometimes writes about education. Who are some of your favorites, or who do you have high hopes for the future?
I have high hopes for more community voice. Even when the press is reporting on a lot of these issues, the community is reluctant to lend their time and their efforts because they're very much living the reality of the same old, same old. So it's like, well, you organize, you give testimony, you show up at school committee meeting, the teachers are there, the kids are there, the parents are there, and they're giving their all, and and in the meantime, they're not really feeling listened to. They're not really feeling respected or centered in the process. And then in the end, the decisions are also not going their way. So it's one thing for the decision not to go in the favor of the broader community voice. That's going to happen, especially in a district that has a lot of overdue hard decisions to be made. But for people to be listened to and respected in the meantime is really important. So I don't know what would have to change between the broader authentic community experience and the press, but there is a gap. You can see the patterns in reporting of who will speak up and speak out, and like I mentioned earlier, like it's not often the day-to-day parent that's getting up with the sun and packing 3 lunches and sending their kids off to 3 different schools. Like when is that going to be the front page voice that is really telling their most authentic story and having it heard and respected and responded to in thoughtful and meaningful ways? Like that's the freedom dreaming that comes to mind for me when you ask about favorites. They're the ones that I have the opportunity and the privilege of listening to in our family advisory board meetings with school facts, and they speak from the heart, but they're not heard and responded to with that reciprocal passion and respect that they deserve.
And not centered in the coverage, as you just pointed out. It's strange that continues to happen, or maybe strange is the wrong word. There are models for this. Memphis, for example, has a parent organization called Memphis Lift, and the coverage in Memphis has been, or was for at least a period, very parent-centered.
Mm-hmm.
And the lead advocate there, Sarah Carpenter, said to reporters, hey, if you're not covering parents, you're not covering schools.
Yeah.
Talk to us every time, all the time. And it sounds like that has yet to happen as much as it could or should in Boston. Yeah,
and so much of it is around trust building. Is it really worth their time, energy, and effort to put their family story and experience out there if it's not going to be a lever for change, and they don't have a lot of evidence that shows it will be a lever for change? So the reluctance is understandable, but a few factors that could shift would need to shift, and they wouldn't be impossible moves to make. There just has to be the intentionality and the political will to do so.
Renee Wilkinson from School Facts Boston, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wishes for 2026.
Thank you.